The year is 60 AD, and a Roman army under General Gaius Suetonius Paulinus stands silent yet determined, as before them a vast horde of some 200,000 Britons converge on their position. Yet the army that thirsted for Roman blood was not led by a king or a lord, but by the warrior queen Boudica, and the decisive clash to come was to decide the fate of Roman Britain. By 60 AD and the climax of the Great Revolt under Boudica, Rome's presence on the island of Britain was still new. Julius Caesar himself had campaigned briefly in the land during his larger Gallic campaign in the years 55 and 54 BC, even extracting tribute from some tribes but not securing a permanent hold over the region. Despite this lackluster attempt at conquest, the southern part of Britain was demystified to the extent that in the century following these events, various leaders, from Augustus forward, desired to conquer the island properly, yet the ambition was not a priority. Events, however, soon conspired to bring Britannia, as the Romans called it, into the imperial fold. A pro-Roman tribe, the Atrebates, based around modern Silchester, was annexed by the Cativellani, who had recently usurped the Trinobantes as the dominant tribe in southeastern Britain. Since Verica, the chief of the Atrebates, was recognised and thus protected by Rome, this gave the latter the corpus belli needed to act against Caraticus's Catulluvani in defence of their client. Caligula began preparations for invasion in around 40 AD, but these were halted, by one account, due to the emperor's insanity, as he ordered the legions to form up and face the channel before further instructing them to gather seashells as plunder from the sea. Caligula's assassination the next year did, however, make way for a more serious attempt. The newly minted emperor Claudius needed a glorious campaign to solidify his own grip on power, and in 43 AD ordered his own invasion of the island under the direct command of Aulus Plautius. The Romans crossed in 3 waves, totaling some 14,000 men, with the port of departure generally agreed to have been Boulogne, and the landing in Kent, possibly at modern Richborough. The Catulluvani resisted fiercely, but were ultimately driven back, the Romans gaining a permanent foothold in the region by 47 AD. But resistance was not universal, with leaders like Cogidubnus, a possible heir of Verica, and Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, actually allied to Rome. Leaders like Prasutagus likely realised the futility of meeting the heavily armed, disciplined legions in open battle, given Britannic warriors were neither disciplined or armoured. Prasutagus may even have been installed as king of the Iceni, following resistance from the tribe, though this is uncertain. Men like Prasutagus submitted and agreed to help their new masters administer the newly won province, in return for prestige for retaining their own sub-rule, as well as their lands. Another client kingdom, the Brigantes, was established further north as a buffer, with the Roman provincial capital itself settled in Camulodunum, or modern Colchester. The next decade saw rapid cultural transformation, with the building of many Roman towns, the most enduring being Londinium, or modern-day London, as well as the establishment of a coin-based economic system which took the native Britons away from the barter-style economy that they were used to. The lead-up to the eponymous battle truly began with the death of Prasutagus in around 60 AD. Ruling lands roughly located in modern-day Suffolk and Norfolk, he willed, perhaps he believed wisely, that his kingdom should be divided between his Roman overlords and his own 2 daughters, whom he had sired with his wife Queen Boudica. The Roman source Cassius Dio gives us some hint as to this formidable woman's appearance and character, describing her as tall in stature and in appearance most terrifying, her countenance stern, with her red hair falling down to her hips, and her having a harsh voice. Dio also noted the Queen's unusual intelligence, which may indicate that she was either a droid or had close connections with them, given this class of individuals was effectively the intellectual elite of Celtic societies. Meanwhile, in 54 AD, Claudius was replaced by Nero as emperor, and he in turn appointed a new governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. Previously, as part of his friendship with Rome, Prasutagus had also been lent some 40 million sesterces of Roman currency in an effort to economically integrate within the empire, which at the time must have seemed like a smart move, given this was the only effective way his people could trade with their new Roman overlords. This loan, however, was to be the Iceni's downfall. Under Nero, Paulinus felt pressured to recoup funds through forced repayment of loans, including interest, as well as through taxes, so that when the king of the Iceni died in 60 AD, the lands now under his widowed wife Boudica and her two daughters were simply too much to resist. Paulinus used the loan as an excuse to violate the previous will of the dead king, demanding full repayment of the principal, as well as interest, immediately. To this end he ordered his legions into Iceni territory, going door to door seizing anything of value, which included enslaving any men and raping the young women. Two prominent victims of the latter violation were the daughters of Boudica and Prasutagus themselves. At this, Boudica attempted to intervene, but was seized. Her clothes were torn from her body before she was beaten bloody in full view of her people. This brutal treatment may have broken most people. However, Boudica was not most people, and in response she rallied her own folk, as well as several other tribes, including the Trinobantes, in revolt. Boudica, however, was no fool, and before striking the initial blow, waited for the bulk of Roman power under Paulinus to leave the region. Paulinus was conveniently absent on campaign to the west in Anglesey. This left Camulodunum vulnerable, and the Queen grasped her chance to sate her thirst for vengeance. The attack on Camulodunum was vicious. The site had been the former capital of the Trinobantes tribe, but was now a colonia, or settlement designed to help secure a Roman province. The Roman veterans present had done little to ingratiate themselves with locals, mistreating them and even building a temple to the Emperor Claudius, which locals were forced to finance. At sighting Boudica's army, the Roman residents appealed to Procurator Catus Decianus for aid, in response to which the latter sent just 200 auxiliary troops of barely armed slaves. The Britons fell on the outnumbered defenders with fury, putting any Roman man they could find to the sword, forcing the remainder into the temple, which fell after 2 days of siege. To commemorate this victory, the Britons even decapitated a bronze statue of the Emperor Nero that likely stood outside of the temple, keeping the head as a trophy. The Roman defeat at Camulodunum was compounded by the destruction of the relieving Legion 9 Hispana under Quintus Batilius Cerialis. Boudica's men overwhelmed and slaughtered the infantry of this legion, with only some of the cavalry, as well as Cerialis himself, escaping. This additional disaster was more than enough to prompt the flight of Decianus to Gaul, with Cassius Dio lamenting that all this ruin was brought upon the Romans by a woman, a fact which in itself caused the greatest shame. Meanwhile, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus moved against the Isle of Anglesey, named Mona by the Romans, which was one of the most important religious sites in Britain. Its destruction thus a key requirement in the cultural subjugation of the tribes. Tacitus records that upon invading Mona, the Romans were confronted by a mass of warriors, but with them droids and black-attired women, their hair bedraggled and waving flaming braids. The droids chanted ominously as the women began to advance on the Romans wading ashore. The whole bizarre scene unsettled the advancing Romans to the point where Paulinus had to shame them to action, shouting that they should not be hindered by the women. This caused the Romans to snap out of their stupor. The men stabbed their way through the women before making short work of the droids chanting above. The weirdest, no, most unsettling aspect of this whole episode was yet to come, as the invaders quickly realised that the ground on which the droids had been chanting was actually a giant funeral pyre, which a surviving woman, flaming brand in hand, set alight. The Romans had unwittingly participated in a mass human sacrifice, which the superstitious Romans could not have ignored, perhaps fearing divine repercussions for their act. Following the slaughter on Anglesey, Paulinus heard news of the destruction of his capital. Deciding to march eastwards towards Londinium ahead of his troops, he found he had a stark choice before him. Boudica's horde next resolved to raise Londinium itself, yet the governor knew this was not the place to confront the rebels, given his small numbers. Having received intelligence of Cerealis' defeat, he cautiously chose to withdraw, taking as many able men as possible with him, but abandoning the rest to their fate. The entire town was engulfed by flames, with Boudica ordering that all enslaved tribal men be freed. This action further bolstered her already huge numbers, with an estimated total of over 200,000 by this point. St. Albans, too, was destroyed around this time. Paulinus' decision was truly costly, with total estimates of Roman dead in Colchester, London and St. Albans being between 70 to 80,000. Tacitus gives a gory description of events in London, stating that capture was absent from the rebels' minds, they desiring only to kill and torture their enemies in all manner of ways, including crucifixion, hanging, and other gory methods. Cassius Dio even states that the noblest women had their breasts torn off and sewn to their mouths, whilst being spitted upon pikes, though such description must be taken with a large grain of salt, considering he is a hostile source. Paulinus, meanwhile, used this time to muster a larger force, calling to him as many as could be had, though notably a certain Ponius Posthumus, with his legion to Augusta, ignored this call, perhaps indicating the severity of the crisis. In all, Paulinus did manage to amass a force of around 10,000, which he clearly deemed enough to confront his foe, given the subsequent events. Marching along Watling Street, Boudica's massive army confronted the Romans at an unspecified location. However, we do know some details about the field of battle itself, with Paulinus expertly deploying his legionaries in a defile with thick woodland to his back and flanks. An open field lay before his lines, which would serve to funnel the Britons into a frontal assault. Boudica's giant army of some 230,000 Celts zeroed in on the Roman position, meaning if this fanciful number is true, Paulinus' force was outnumbered by over 20 to 1. Boudica's men would have been scantily armoured, with any protection rare, though it must be remembered that some gear and weaponry would have been seized from the towns sacked by them. However, what these men lacked in armour, weapons and discipline, they made up for in sheer numbers. Out in front of the massive main body of Celtic men were the vanguard of aristocratic war chariots. These were rapid mounted units, capable of quickly engaging and retreating from enemies. Facing Boudica's Britons were around 4,000 legion heavy infantry stationed in the centre of Paulinus' formation, with 3 cohorts of auxiliar or supporting troops on each flank, and 2 wings of cavalry on both ends of the line, for the total of 10,000. Paulinus did have another key set of advantages above terrain. Roman soldiers wore suits of armour, the scutum, a large rectangular shield, covering the legionnaire from neck to sandal, and the central metal portion, a decent secondary bludgeon that was useful upon first contact with the enemy. Furthermore, each man wielded the famous gladius or short sword, which unlike the longer cleavers of the later medieval age, were designed for quick and efficient stabbing attacks from behind the Romans' large shields. Finally, the Romans also had long spears and javelins, and threw a series of these before contact, thus weakening the impetus of any enemy charge whilst also depriving many warriors of their own shields, if they stuck and weighed them down. Yet, if these advantages gave the Britons reason to fear the upcoming clash, then they certainly didn't show it, as they appeared confident enough of victory to bring a large retinue with them, which formed a large ring of wagons far behind their lines. From these, the old, very young, and women of the warriors urged on their men as they closed in on the Romans. Meanwhile, both leaders apparently took to bolstering the resolve of their hosts, with Cassius Dio stating that Paulinus dismissed the Celts before them as a rabble who were not even properly equipped, and supplemented by women, which showed how weak they really were. One of these women, the Queen herself, rode up and down the front line of her warriors in her royal chariot, famously orating that she fought not for wealth, but for her outraged daughters who stood beside her, and that she, a woman, would face the Romans even if the men preferred their slavery. At this, Boudica opened the battle with a charge of her chariots, which peppered and harassed the front ranks of the Roman lines. However, without proper support and giving the Romans tight line and large shields, this would have been largely ineffective. Roman formations presented a long wall of shields, with men in the ranks rotating as battle raged, using their gladiuses to stab between their shields into chainmail or the bare chests of the charging Celts, thus constantly refreshing their lines, allowing exhausted men to rest and fresher men to come up. Probably taking a few losses from this initial barrage, the Romans braced themselves as the chariots retreated and the vast waves of Celtic warriors streamed across the open ground, screaming their war cries and brandishing their swords and spears. It seems that nuance and clever tactics were not at play here for the Britons, as they simply charged headlong into the scutums of the legionaries. It was now that Paulinus' smart use of terrain began to show, as the Celts' numbers were effectively mitigated by the narrow defile, the sloped ground also reducing the impetus of the charge further. To make matters worse, the Roman heavy infantry of the centre threw their pila javelins just before the Celts could engage, lessening further the power of their charge. Paulinus would not simply await the assault rooted in place, instead ordering his charge downhill into the oncoming Celts. However, the Roman charge was not without deadly design, with the Roman general advancing in wedge-like formations, which served to break up the cohesion of Boudica's ranks. Faced with the Roman gladius and shield on one side, and their own compressed rear ranks behind, the Celts could do little to resist the Roman juggernaut advancing towards the wagons. Roman tactics, use of terrain and technology weighed heavily towards ensuring their victory, slowly driving the panicked Celts back towards their own wagon ring. The Roman soldier would simply smash their opponent hard with the central metal portion of their shield before ruthlessly stabbing the lightly clad Celt, stepping unceremoniously on or over them to repeat and advance. As the Roman infantry moved relentlessly forward, Paulinus' cavalry on the wings completed the disaster for the Celts, smashing in on the flanks. It was now that the true cost of the rebels' decision to allow their women, infirm and children to accompany them dawned, as the ring of wagons acted as a barrier to retreat, the Roman advance crushing the remaining warriors against their own wagons. Paulinus was not in a merciful mood, with his men massacring all in their path, with men, women, the children, and even the animals of the camp put to the sword. This complete slaughter was certainly odd, given that draft animals could be sold, and captured women, children, and even men enslaved for profit. That the Romans did wholesale eradicate every living thing in the vicinity that day could indicate how precarious the situation had become, or at the very least, the very real enmity felt by both sides for each other. In all, the battle cost the lives of some 80,000 Britons that day, a number that easily dwarfed the mere 400 or so Romans lost, which, if accurate, made for a stunning and complete victory for the Roman occupiers. Paulinus, though, was far from satisfied and headed east to wipe the lands clean, of Iceni and Trinovantes. Meanwhile, the commander of the legion near modern-day Exeter, who had ignored the call to arms, Postumus, soon heard of the Roman victory and fell on his sword, knowing he had denied his legion a share in the glory and would likely await a grim fate for his insubordination. Paulinus, however, did not have everything his own way. The Emperor Nero himself was said to have been shaken enough by events that he had seriously considered withdrawing Roman troops from Britannia, and, now fearing further revolt if the brutal suppression of Paulinus continued, ordered the governor recalled and replaced. As for Boudica herself, it is known that she escaped the slaughter of Watling Street, but it's ultimately a mystery as to how she met her end. Tacitus states that the queen took her own life soon afterwards by taking poison, though Cassius Dio simply states, less dramatically, that she died of illness, her remaining supporters giving her an extravagant burial. Roman rule in Britain was eventually secured, but not eternal. Peoples of the far north, known as Picts or Painted People, were not wholly subdued, and Roman rule fully collapsed at the beginning of the 5th century with the fall of the West. Whilst Roman rule ended, Boudica's legacy endured, being embellished and preserved in the Victorian era, a defiant stand against the most powerful empire and army of its time, celebrated to this day.